The next topic, learning and behavior analysis. If you have any like relatives or maybe your own parents, if they studied psychology during the maybe 1960s or 1970s, if you ask them about what you learned about psychology in the university, probably they will ask you, they will answer you that, okay, what we learned during the college days was, what is psychology? Psychology is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And what is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is the dog. Originally, a dog doesn't salivate when the dog hears about a sound. But whenever you play the sound, when the food comes, gradually the dog will start to salivate, 流口水, when he hears the sound. And that is what psychology is. Okay. The reason why, like if you ask people, like who studied psychology in the maybe 50 years ago, that is the only thing they can recall. It is because, at least in America, okay, and you know psychology, when the psychology taught in major universities in the world, basically it's more like American psychology. For American psychology, it was dominated by behaviorism almost 50 years. And what is behaviorism? 中文是翻译行为主义哦。The meaning of behaviorism, or the goal of behaviorism is, the chief goal of psychology is the prediction and the control of behavior. If you look at the definition here, what's the difference between the definition here and the contemporary definition about psychology? The major difference is, nowadays, when people are talking about what psychology is, actually we are concerned about if a person has a certain behavior, we want to know why he or she has this behavior. Okay. But for them, for behaviorists, they don't care that much about the why. They care more about how. If I want to change your behavior, for example, some people, they might complain to you that I can't concentrate in class. And for behaviorists, they don't care about why. They only care about, then what should I do? What should we do to fix your problem, to make you concentrate in class? I don't really care about why you can't concentrate. Okay. So there's a subtle difference between behaviorists and like contemporary psychology. Okay. So this is basically a chart that can easily explain what psychology is. So psychologists, we are looking at human behavior. And most of us, we probably wouldn't deny that every behavior has the physiological basis. Okay, we have the nervous system, we have neurotransmitters, and we have endocrine system. We have those neurons, those wet stuff inside of our body that governs our behavior. But in addition to that, okay, what causes those nervous system to activate? It could be the genes, it could be the environment, or it could be free will, and we don't really know whether this free will exists. For this connection, the physiology and your behavior, they are easy to solve because we have a lot of different techniques to try to find the relationship between your body and your mind. But for this part, it's relatively harder because it's really hard to really look at every single details about your genes, or we don't know whether that there is a relationship or interaction between genes or environment, and we don't know whether free will exists. So this connection is relatively harder to be disentangled. For behaviorism, they don't look at the physiological part because, as I said, the major goal of behaviorism is to predict or to control your behavior. I can't change your physiology, so why should I bother to look at the physiology? Also, genes. Because I can't change the genes, so why should I bother to look at the relationship between your genes and behavior? And free will, no one really knows what free will is. Even there is, it's really hard to change. It's hard to modify. By definition, free will is free. So, which means that it can't be affected, it can't be changed by another person. So for behaviorism, they don't look at genes or free will or their physiology. The only thing they look at is something you can change, which is the environment. So what they do is try to find the relationship between your environment and your behavior. And how does the environment modify or shape or change the behavior? It could be classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Okay, so in the next hour, I'm going to introduce what classical conditioning is and what operant conditioning is, and actually they are not hard. They are relatively easy, much easier than what we have introduced a few weeks ago. Okay. So after I introduce these two, we have some exercises. The exercises are. There are some human behavior phenomena, okay, that can be potentially explained by classical conditioning or operant conditioning. The first one is Caucasian models, okay, dominate the fashion industry. If you think about the word models, probably for us here, like in Taiwan, yes, it's likely that you can think about a Taiwanese model. It's possible. And it's also very likely you can think, when you think about model, you think about a Westerner, European, or Caucasian. It's still very likely. Okay. But like for us, basically, you don't think much about other races. But it's more like a particularly Caucasian, like European. Why? When you think about models, when you think about TV commercials, how come that kind of European-looking face, it just comes into your mind? Okay. First. The second one, the color of red attracts attention. We usually use the color of red when the teacher is grading your essays. They use red pens. And when you are driving on the road, the red light signals you have to stop. Usually a red thing indicates something dangerous. But why? The third one, anorexia nervosa. Okay, what is this? It's a psychological disorder. 中文叫厌食症. The symptoms is those people, they can't take in any food. And it could be quite dangerous because it could be fatal. They could die because their body doesn't have enough nutrition. There could be a lot of potential reasons why people developed anorexia nervosa, but one of the major reasons is they have distorted or wrong body image. Image about their body. Usually in most of the cases, they usually think they are just too fat and they can't take in any food, up to a point that they can't take in any food anymore. Okay. And you can also explain anorexia nervosa by one of the conditionings. Okay, so first, what is classical conditioning? The word classical here, 经典的古典, actually it has nothing to do with the whole conditioning. Why we call it classical is just because there are several different kinds of conditioning, and this is the earliest one, so we call it classical. So when it comes to classical conditioning, we have to introduce this dog. And who owned this dog? He, Ivan Pavlov. He studied physiology. Okay. So he wasn't a psychologist. Okay. And he won a Nobel Prize, but not in his research in psychology, but in physiology. Okay. He studied digestive system. And this dog originally was just a subject, a guinea pig of his studies. to study the dog's digestive system, he designed a device which can drain the dog's saliva, 口水, into the outside of the body. So he can measure how much the dog salivates. Okay. Originally, the purpose was just to study the digestive system, but there was one day some interesting thing happened. Normally the dog will only salivate 分泌唾液 when he sees the food, but there was one day the food hadn't shown up, but the research system just walking into the lab. Even before the food showed up, just by hearing the steps of the research system, the dog started to salivate, which is bizarre, which is strange. Because why should a dog salivate to the sound of the steps of the research system? Because supposedly the steps of the research system should have nothing to do with, it shouldn't generate this kind of physiological responses. But how come a dog will respond to the steps? The reason is because usually when the dog when the sound of the steps appear, usually it means that the food is coming. So even the food hasn't turned up yet, but the steps of the research system the sound of that steps is enough to induce a salivation response. This phenomenon is called classical conditioning. So if you look at this picture here, okay, originally, conditioning, probably this word is not very commonly used in our everyday life. You just try to understand conditioning as learning. Okay, before conditioning means before learning. The food can induce salivation. Okay. So we call the food unconditioned stimulus because it's something you don't have to learn. Unconditioned means unlearned, like you don't have to learn that you can generate salivation. So this we call it unconditioned stimulus, and we call it unconditioned response. Originally, before learning, if you hear a sound, this is the in-chow tuning fork. The sound, supposedly, it doesn't induce a salivation response. So we call it conditioned stimulus because this is something you have to learn. It doesn't happen by nature. Okay? So we call it conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. Okay? But during conditioning, if you just pair tuning fork sound and food all the times, whenever you hear the sound, you see the food. If they just appear together all the times, up to a point, the dog will salivate even without the food. He can salivate only by looking at only by hearing the tuning fork. Okay. This process is called classical conditioning. The two things originally they are irrelevant, but they always showed up together up to a point that you see one thing and you generate the response to the other thing. This is classical conditioning. Okay, last hour we talked about hypnosis, and actually a very commonly asked question about hypnosis is it real? This question is actually very hard to answer. The reason is when you want to ask something is real or not, you can only rely on personal report. So for people, when they are being hypnotized, some people, they do tell you that when the therapist gave me a suggestion, I did feel that I became what he wanted to be. They would tell you that it is real. But how do we know it's really real, or it's just, some people, they are just more collaborative and maybe they are just better at acting or something. Actually, there's no way to know about this unless you become the person being hypnotized. Otherwise, there's no way to feel how other people feel unless you become the other person. And the truth is you can't become another person. So there's no way you can know whether so-called hypnosis real or not. But you can only rely on, observable behavior and personal report. According to those observable behavior and personal reports, that is the result. Most of the people, they can't be hypnotized. Only a small amount of people, they could be hypnotized. This is the result. And actually, there's no way you can understand and to feel how those small portion of people feel. Okay? So hypnosis is real or not? It's actually it's not a very easy question to answer. Okay, so let's go back to learning. Classical conditioning. Okay, two things originally they were irrelevant, but they always happen together, and over time, up to a point that you see one thing and you generate the response as if you have seen the other thing. That is classical conditioning. Okay. For classical conditioning to happen, there are some requirements about their temporal relationship. There are 4 possible temporal relationship between the CS and the UCS. CS, conditioned stimulus, okay, the tuning fork, the sound. Unconditioned stimulus, the food. This kind of relationship is called delay conditioning because the presentation of the food, there is a delay between the presentation of the food and the presentation of the sound. And this is delay conditioning. And in this case, yes, classical conditioning happens. The second example, the second situation, we call it trace conditioning. It means that you present the sound and you terminate the sound. And then there is a temporal gap between the termination of the sound and the presence of the food. There is a gap here, and we call it trace when there's a gap. This is called simultaneous conditioning. You present sound and food together, and this is called backward conditioning. You present the food first. Among the 4 kinds of conditions, classical conditioning only happen in the first 2 conditions. For the third and the fourth, it's less efficient. Okay. And actually, it's not too difficult to imagine why it's less efficient, because you can imagine that if you present the sound and the food together, for the dog's attention will be totally drawn to the food and ignore the sound. So the sound doesn't help at all. For the backward conditioning, also the same. If you present the food first, the attention will be drawn to the food and you just ignore this tone, the sound at all. Okay, you just leave it out. So for the last 2 conditions, classical conditioning is less efficient. And this is what happens when we are acquiring classical conditioning. Okay. At the beginning, we call it acquisition. Acquisition also means learning. At the beginning, this is the time. At the beginning, the dog doesn't salivate when he hears the sound. But you pair the sound and the food together repetitively, and gradually, the dog will start to salivate when he hears the sound. Okay. In this process, we call it acquisition. Up to a point, you see it alone. You go into the second stage. Second stage here means extinction. Extinction means that you only present the CS. You only present the sound without showing the food. So the salivation response is getting less, which makes sense because now you only hear the sound, but there's no food at all. So the dog salivates less, up to a point it becomes 0. But interestingly, this 0 is not true 0. Why is it not true 0? Because if you give the dog a break, here, a rest period, if you give him a break, just take a break, we are not doing anything, just rest. After a while, if you present the sound again, then the salivation response will happen again. It comes back. This kind of phenomena, we call it spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous means that 自发性的哈, it means that there is no external force. It just happens on its own. So this is spontaneous. A recovery, it recovers. Originally it was 0, but now it comes back, so it's a recovery. And this is called spontaneous recovery. This phenomenon is quite interesting and quite important in learning, because in human learning behavior, you can see a lot of this kind of spontaneous recovery phenomenon. When you learn something, for example, when you are studying something repetitively, and then you take a break, and you thought you have forgotten about what you have learned, but actually you haven't forgotten it. Your skills, your knowledge, somehow they are just stored somewhere. So when you come across the old knowledge again, it seems that your knowledge has come back. This is also a case of spontaneous recovery. Okay. Stimulus generalization. When you learn something, you generalize your learning outcome to other similar stuff. So, for example, if for the dog, whenever you hit the tone of 1,000 hertz, you present the food. So when the dog is learning, you condition the dog by the tone of 1,000 hertz and the food. Okay, this is what you use for learning. Okay. And then, after the dog has learned the relationship between the food and the sound, you present a 2,000 hertz sound, which is higher. Yes, the dog still salivates. So the learning outcome of 1,000 hertz has been generalized to other frequencies. Okay, although the likelihood is less, but it still happens. For this kind of phenomenon is stimulus generalization. You learn stimulus A, but your learning outcome could be generalized to stimulus B. So this is stimulus generalization. Another thing, contingency is important in classical conditioning. What is contingency? When we are talking about contingency, when we say that A is contingent on B, it means that whenever B happens, A will happen. And whenever there's no B, there's no A. When you see A, you see B. When you don't see A, you don't see B. This is contingency. So if we go back to the relationship of classical conditioning, the CS and UCS. CS is the tone, the sound. UCS is the food. In the condition A, it's called random group. So the relationship between CS and UCS, the relationship between the sound and the food, they are random. So sometimes you see both, sometimes you see neither, sometimes you only see the food, sometimes you only hear the sound. So their relationship is random. In this case, it's really hard to learn. But in the second case, contingency group, whenever you hear the tone, you see the food. When you don't hear the tone, you don't see the food. Whenever you hear the tone, you see the food. So they always come together and go together. In this case, it's contingent that you can learn. Okay, so application. So we have done with classical condition. We have explained what classical conditioning is now. So how does classical conditioning play a role in our life? Yes, it plays a role in our everyday life, particularly in marketing. When you see those TV commercials or like this poster, this is poster for perfume. Okay. When you see this kind of commercials or posters, it's usually you see a very attractive person. It could be a man or could be a woman. Okay, with this product. Why do those manufacturers? Why do they want to use like models on their product? Okay, the reason is they want to build the relationship between their product and attractiveness. Okay? Although this perfume has nothing to do with attractiveness, but when you see the commercial, they always come together. So over time, you will associate the attractiveness and their product. So you will want to buy their product. You think by buying their product, you can become attractive as well. So that was classical conditioning. What is classical conditioning? Two stimuli can be paired if they co-occur intensively. But can any two stimuli be equally paired? Or there are some things that are just easier to be learned. There are some other things that are harder to be learned. Yes, for some reason, for human beings, maybe it's something written in our genes or written in our brain that we seem to be born to fear some particular stimuli, like the shape of the snake, the shape of the spider. For some people, they don't have to learn. They just develop the feeling. They develop the fearful feelings for them. Okay. So for some particular shapes, for some reason, it's just easier to be associated with fear or with danger. Or like this one, taste aversion learning. Usually for classical conditioning to occur, you need to pair them repetitively, more than once. But some classical conditioning, they can just happen by one shot pairing. Like this. Probably some of you have this kind of experience, that you have diarrhea, okay, and you just happen to eat something, totally irrelevant to the diarrhea, but you just happen to eat something beforehand. And after the diarrhea, 腹泻, you just develop a very aversive feeling for that food. Maybe you just happen to eat a strawberry before diarrhea. Actually, the diarrhea wasn't caused by that strawberry, but because you just happened to eat before the diarrhea. So after that, you just develop that kind of aversive, fearful feeling for any strawberry. For this kind of pairing, particularly food with sickness, they are just easier to be paired. Okay. And there must be some evolutionary explanation for that. Okay, so that was classical conditioning. Okay, now we are going into the next conditioning, operant conditioning. Or some books may use instrumental conditioning. Operant conditioning, 中文我们翻操作制约。有的书会叫 instrumental conditioning， 叫工具制约。So by definition, you need an instrument to perform this conditioning. Okay, and what is this instrument? The instrument is you have to rely on this effect, law of effect. A response leads to a satisfactory outcome, and you will continue doing it. If a response leads to an unsatisfactory outcome, you would avoid doing it. 用中文讲就是趋吉避凶啦。Okay, if you do something and then something good happens, of course you're doing it. If you do something bad happens, then you will never do it again. Okay. We have this kind of nature. Not only us, but basically most of the animals, most of the biological organisms, we have this kind of tendency. So this tendency is quite useful because we can use this tendency to control. Remember, what is the goal of behaviorism? They try to control and predict human behavior. And this is a good way that we can use to control other people. Okay? Like this rat in this box. This box is designed by him, Skinner. Okay? He was an American psychologist, and he developed this kind of box, so we call it Skinner box. Inside of the Skinner box, there is a rat, and there is some devices like this lever. So what's the function of this lever? Whenever you press this lever, the food will come. So whenever the rat learns the relationship between the food and the pressing the lever, the rat will continue pressing the lever. And this is operant conditioning. Okay, you increase a certain behavior by giving a reward. Or in some other cases, you stop some behavior by giving some punishment. Okay. You use punishment or reward to control, to manipulate other people or animals, this kind of technique or this kind of conditioning is operant conditioning, okay, or instrumental conditioning. The instrument you use is the reward or the punishment. And actually, most of us are using operant conditioning like very often. Okay, for parents, when they are trying to teach their children or parent their children, they use similar technique. When the child is doing something good, you give him some candy. When the child is doing something bad, you give him a punishment. This is a very typical case of operant conditioning. Or when you are trying to train your pets, the techniques you use is also operant conditioning. Okay. And let's have a look at this very interesting video about how to train a pigeon to differentiate different artworks. Okay, so this is a very typical example that we use operant conditioning to train our pet. So in this case, the tool used is to give the pigeon food, trying to increase a certain behavior. Okay. The food here, we call it reinforcement because we try to increase his behavior. And the tool you use to increase a certain behavior, we call it reinforcement. But for reinforcement, there are two kinds of reinforcement. The first one is positive, the second one is negative. Positive is, for example, if you have a child and you want to, train your child to behave, and then this is the rule you use. Whenever your child is doing something good, and you give him a sticker, that sticker is a positive reinforcement. And what is negative reinforcement? You spank your child every day. Basically, you're abusing your child every day. But when he's doing something good, you don't have spank. You don't hit your child when he's doing something good. So this is also a reinforcement, but it's not performed by giving him something, but by taking out something that he doesn't like. So this is also reinforcement. Okay? As long as you do something to increase a certain behavior, it's a reinforcement. Whether it's positive or negative depends on how you use this reinforcement. If you use the reinforcement by giving him something, that is positive. But if you use the reinforcement by taking out something he doesn't like, then that is negative. The same logic also applies to punishment. When your child is naughty and is throwing a tantrum or something, you give him a spank, and this is positive punishment. Or it could be negative. You give your child stickers every day, but as long as he's not doing well, you don't give him sticker. This is also a punishment. But for positive is you give him something, but negative is you are taking out something that he likes. They are both punishment, but one is positive, the other is negative. Okay. And the thing that you use to reinforce a certain behavior is called reinforcer. Usually for pets, we give the pets food. So like food is a primary reinforcer. But for humans, of course, if you want to train humans, train your children, train your student, probably you wouldn't use food. You use something else. Probably you might use like money or grades. Money and grades, they are conditioned reinforcer. Why are they called conditioned? Because we are not born to like money or grades. The reason why you like money or you like grades because you have learned that money can bring you something good or high grades can bring you something good. So that's why you like them. But this kind of feeling, it comes from learning. It's not born with you. So they are called conditioned reinforcer. How do we use operant conditioning in our everyday life. The most typical example is parenting. Okay? For parenting, when we are trying to teach a child or train a child to do something, a very common way is to use punishment. When a child is doing something bad, you just give him a punishment. But when you are using punishment, there is something that you have to keep in mind, that your child might learn to, because you are using something a little bit aggressive to him, and probably he will learn to use aggressive behavior to other people. This kind of hypothesis is called coercion model. Okay. And there are some studies, they have shown that the more, for example, this 2007 study, the more the children have been spanked early in life, okay, the more likely they showed increase in aggressive behavior, 3-6 months or first grade. And why? Possibly it is because when you are trying to punish your child, and because usually for those punishments, they are mostly slightly aggressive, and this kind of aggressive can be learned by children. So when they grow up, probably they will also use this kind of aggressive behavior as a strategy to treat others. This is something you have to be cautious when you are parenting a child. Okay. Shaping. What is shaping? Shaping is 行为塑造了哈。When you want to create or when you want to train a behavior that is quite hard, so you break it into small steps. This is shaping. Okay. For example, if you want to train your dog to maybe, I just use a very extreme example. If you want to train your dog to use the toilet bowl, for example, the toilet bowl is not designed for dogs. So actually it's quite hard for the dog to use the toilet bowl as a human being. But if you really want to do it, probably you have to break the ultimate goal into many small steps. Okay? Step 1, when the dog goes into the toilet room and you give him food. Step 1, going into the toilet room. Then step 2, the dog has to go into somewhere near the toilet bowl. Step 2. Step 3, the dog has to climb up the toilet bowl. And step 4, the dog has to properly use the toilet bowl. So using the toilet bowl is hard, but you just break it into small steps and achieve it one by one. So this whole process is called shaping. Okay, so that was classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So what is classical conditioning? Two things. Usually they are irrelevant at the beginning, but they just happen to appear together repetitively. So over time, you see one thing and you feel like you have seen the other. Okay. This is classical conditioning. And operant conditioning is a strategy you try to train people by using reinforcement and punishment. Okay. So if you understand the meaning of the two conditionings, probably you can somehow guess why there are some phenomena, some strange phenomena you can see. Like the first one, the fashion industry is dominated by Caucasian. Caucasian here means like European white-looking models. How come it seems that their models, when you think about modeling, it feels like their faces come into your mind, like European looking. Even for Asian models, usually they look more, their features, they are kind of Caucasian, more sharper features. They can become models. Why does this kind of thing happen? Is there any possible way to explain it by classical conditioning or operant conditioning? Like when people are thinking about beauty, it feels like when people are thinking of beauty, that kind of European looking seems to be the standard of beauty. Why do people develop this kind of association? Does anyone want to give it a try? Is there any possible way to explain about it with classical conditioning? or operant conditioning. Actually, there are a lot of different ways to probably this. Okay, this is just an exercise. It doesn't mean that it's true. Okay. Maybe sometime during the history, for example, if we talk about the fashion industry, maybe this kind of industry, probably because they just began like in Europe. So when people are thinking about fashion, they just somehow they're associated with Europe, because maybe this kind of the fashion concept just originated in Europe. Okay, so people just associate fashion and Europe. This is one explanation. Or there could be another reason, that because if you look at like how different countries are developed, okay, like in the year of 2016, most of the so-called developed countries, it's not 100%, but it's more likely that they are European or European countries. So people may somehow develop an association between developedness, okay, with maybe European looking. Okay, so then that biases how people judge attractiveness. This is just one of the explanations. But in order to test a hypothesis, you need to design a study, okay? But this kind of thing, it's really hard to design an experiment. Or does anyone have any other opinion? Okay. The first one could be more complicated. The second one should be easier. We use the color of red a lot, particularly when you want to signal a danger. You want to catch people's attention. You use red. Is there any explanation for this? Why is red unique? Okay. Yeah, so usually when you see red, it's either you have injury, or in most of the cases they are not very good things. Particularly when you see blood, or when you see someone very red on his face or in his eyes, usually it means that there's something wrong with this person. So we associate red with accident, injuries, sickness. Okay, so over time we become more sensitive to the color of red. Okay, this one, anorexia nervosa. Okay, 厌食症啊. People, they just can't take in any food, and a major cause of this disorder is they have distorted, unrealistic body image about themselves. And could you explain this disorder with classical conditioning or operant conditioning? Classical conditioning, because you associate food with fat. Okay, so you don't want to be fat, so you stop eating food. But actually, this is quite interesting. Why do people don't want? Actually, fat itself is not a bad thing. It should be a neutral thing. But this is also another issue. Why people think that fat is bad? It's also another classical conditioning. Like people probably like hundreds of years ago, people they didn't think that fat is bad. But nowadays, people always think that someone is fat means it's a bad thing, it's unattractive. This fact itself is also a result, a product of a lot of classical conditioning going on. Okay, so please keep in mind, those exercises we just did, they were just examples, they were just exercises. In order for you to understand the concept of classical conditioning and operant conditioning, it doesn't mean that it is really like that. It doesn't mean that the reason why we are afraid of red things because red reminds us of blood. In psychology, like that we have repetitively talked about, it's a science. So whatever hypothesis you have, you need to design an experiment to prove your hypothesis. Okay, we are coming to the final topic of today's lecture, cognitive influence on learning. Because last hour we talked about behaviorism. Some people, they are more extreme. Some people, they are more moderate. For extreme behaviorists, for them, they only care about the environment and the behavior. They will assume that if you want to create a certain behavior, you have to give the organism, you have to give people a certain stimulus. A certain stimulus will generate a certain behavior. Okay, let's say there is stimulus and response. Stimulus comes from the environment. If you give the stimulus A, and it will generate response A prime. If you give stimulus B, it will generate response B prime. It's a one-to-one relationship, and there's nothing in between. Okay, but as you can imagine that, of course, like your everyday experience that tells you, no, human beings, we are not that easy. It's not like I give you a certain stimulus and you will definitely generate a certain response. And yes, of course, some people, they criticize behaviorism because there are something else in between. And there's something else in between, we call it cognition. Okay, even you have a stimulus A, when your cognitive system receives stimulus A, it could generate a response A prime. It could generate a response B prime. You don't know. Okay, it depends on your cognition. Everyone has a different cognitive system, so you can't really predict what a person will do simply by what you give to him or her. Okay, there is something between. That something in between, we call it cognition. And how did some cognitive psychology criticize behaviorism? Like this is an example. Because there are some studies that shows that in not only for our mind, not only for human being, but even for a rat can create a cognitive map in his mind. Okay, what is a cognitive mind? Like the maze I just showed you in the last hour. There seems to when the rat is running around in this maze, there seems to a map in the rat's mind. Okay, this place cells, they were found relatively more recent, but even before the discovery of place cells, during the probably 60s or 70s, researchers have discovered that if you design a maze like this, and if you have a rat here, if you ask or if you train the rat to run around in this maze, okay, the rat is here and the food is here. Normally, the rat will run straight to the food. Okay. But if you play some trick, for example, if you block A, yes, if you block A, the rat will still find the shortest way to the food. If you block B, the rat will still find the shortest way to the food. Which means that when the rat is running around in this maze, the rat has created a cognitive map inside of his head. Cognitive map, the existence of cognitive map somehow indicates it's not A to A prime, B to B prime. There is something in between. There is something called cognition, and everyone has a different cognition, so you can't predict how a person do what a person will do simply by knowing what the stimulus is. Okay, this is one of the criticism, one piece of evidence that people use to attack or to criticize behaviorism. Okay, so this is how they did. The training stage, the rat is blowing this maze, and during the taste stage, the original rule is blocked. The rat can still find the shortest way to the food. Okay. Or another thing, like concept. How do we learn concept? Like same and behavior, same and different. If I teach a child what is the same, what is different, this kind of abstract concept. When you think about same and different, same is an abstract concept. It doesn't refer to any stimulus. It doesn't refer to any concrete stimulus. But you still can learn about what same is, what difference is. And this can't be explained by simple direct relationship between your stimulus and response. Because for same and different, actually you can't find a corresponding stimulus. But you are still able to learn. Okay. So, and this is another thing. Particularly for children, normally if you want to increase a certain behavior on children, you have to give them reinforcement. But in some of the cases, you don't need to give any reinforcement. You just show the children how you do it, and the children will learn. This kind of learning is observational learning. Okay. Observational learning is a child will learn whatever you give to them without giving any reinforcement or punishment. So I'm going to show you a very famous experiment in psychology. It was conducted by this guy, Albert Bandura. Okay, so this is one of the very famous experiments in the history of psychology. Remember, this is an experiment. They manipulate what the children see because they have the experimental group and the control group. So for the experimental group, the children look at another adult beating that doll called Bobo. Okay? It turns out, yes, after they're watching that adult hitting Bobo, they also become aggressive to that doll as well. They will imitate whatever they watch. Okay, this is an experiment. But of course, some people might be skeptical about this because you are doing an experiment. Probably that effect is just temporary. Maybe the effect doesn't last long. So probably it would be a better idea if you could design a research that seems to be more relevant to our everyday life. So this is another study. Okay, it is not an experiment. It is a correlational study, but it's more relevant to the everyday life. In 1977, a research team, they collected TV watching data of a group of 557 children. So the sample size should be large enough. Okay? And 15 years later, they tried to investigate the relationship between their TV watching behavior and their aggressiveness. And that's the result. They separate the data into male and female. For the female part, these are three groups. Indicates how often, how frequent they watch violent TV shows. Low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency. And you can see a significant increase in aggressive behavior if they watch more TV shows during the childhood. For male, it's even more obvious. The more TV show you watch during the childhood, the more aggressive you become. But of course, this is a correlational study. You are not 100% sure that whether it is because the TV show that increase your behavior or there could be some other factors. Maybe it could be the family. It is because the family they grew up in is aggressive family. So they watch more aggressive TV show. So they turn out to be more aggressive when they grow up. Okay, but anyway, this is the result. Okay, so that is for today. We talked about classical conditioning, and we also introduced some technical terms about professional classical conditioning, and we introduced operant conditioning. Okay, and then we talked about in some of the examples that you can't really explain the human behavior by either of the two and why. So that is for today. Okay.